Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path forward toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Storm, and I'm your host. Today, we're beginning a series of conversations centering our practices of listening to understand and holding competing perspectives in tension. Before we can hope to heal our world, we must first learn to see it how it actually is. By listening to understand, we cultivate our curiosity while surfacing the motivations and views that underlie the issues that divide us. Peacemaking recognizes that my story is not the only story, and holding perspectives in tension allows us to engage the views and experiences of others, even and especially when they do not reconcile with our own. These practices unlock our abilities to better identify causes of and solutions to otherwise intractable conflict. For today's conversation, I'm joined by Sami DiPasquale. Sami is a global citizen with vast experience in refugee and immigrant communities. He spent the majority of his childhood and young adult years in the Middle East and has lived in Jordan, Cyprus, Egypt, and then India before completing college in the United States. Sami engages groups worldwide with profound insights on global migration, peace-building, embodied faith, and narrative change. He explores the forces driving migration, the impact of living one's beliefs, and the power of storytelling to shift perceptions and foster social transformation. Sami is also the founder and director of Abara, a nonprofit based in El Paso, Texas, serving both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. In response to global migration in a polarizing world, Abara inspires connections beyond borders through mutual understanding, education, and meaningful action. Abara hosts immersive border learning experiences, supports dozens of migrant shelters on both sides of the border, and is developing Abara House, a borderland center for beloved community located on a historic river crossing adjacent to the U.S.-Mexico border fence. Sami, welcome to the Learning Core podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, both to talk about the role and importance of listening to understand and the work Abara does, but also to invite our listeners to practice listening to understand and holding perspectives in tension as we dive into some of what you teach folks and share some of the narratives that it's important for us to know, especially around migration. To start our conversation, I'd love to dive into the background and context of the communities you invite people into. The Ciudad Juarez El Paso region is the largest bilingual, binational metropolis in the Western Hemisphere, and it's a region that's often called the borderlands. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what's important to know about the borderlands and the people who make up the community.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sarah, and it's a delight to be a guest on the podcast today. Love the work of Telos. Love so many of the people connected to Telos and feel a lot like kindred spirits for sure between our work here at Abara on the border and with Telos and so many others around the world. And I think one of the most beautiful things about the borderlands for me is the connection from these two very different sides. And of course, it's a lot more than two, but being, for instance, on what is now the US-Mexico border, but what has historically been one community over hundreds of years, but has found itself on two sides of a current day border, and that's been the case for the last 170 years. Although really until probably 9/11, I feel like the two communities in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso were much more connected. They still are very connected, but now the security is way ramped up, and we have a border fence going down the middle of the city. In essence, I mean, in our community, we really do feel like it's one metropolis in two countries. So if you think about any city or town that people might live in around the country or the world, right, what are the reasons that take you to the other side of town to go? Maybe it's to go shopping, maybe it's to go to a show, maybe it's because you have a favorite restaurant over there, maybe it's because your parents live over there or one of your kids or cousins or a family gathering. All of those are the same reasons that people cross back and forth between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And there's so many families that are divided between the two countries. And for some, if they happen to have the privilege of U.S. citizenship or the types of visas that allow them to come and go freely across the border, then that sort of, it still very much feels like one community. But then for those who don't have that ability, it absolutely is very separated. So one thing that's really important to understand is just that we are one community and we're so connected, and yet then we're also divided. And so when we think about tensions, that's definitely one of the tensions, because you have this strong feeling of connection and you have this strong feeling of division. You can go up to this 18-foot, or in some cases, 30-foot border fence and definitely feel disconnected. And yet, while you're standing there, you might hear the vehicles on the other side of the border, and maybe even smell the food grilling, or like at the property where our now offices are, and it's this sort of borderland center that we're developing. I can walk outside of my office and hear very clearly some beautiful music that's floating across the river and through the fence. And so you want to like go see, oh, what are they grilling, or who's playing that music, but you can't quite. So it is that dichotomy, and part of the irony of being on the border, but it's also what makes up this region. I grew up where my parents were from the United States and we spoke English at home, but they had moved to the Middle East before I was born. And so I was born in Jordan and grew up in Jordan and Cyprus for the most part. And so in Jordan, my whole world outside of home was in Arabic. And, often you might refer to someone like me as a third culture kid. So we have one culture that is at home, and for me in English, and then one culture that's at school and in church and is in Arabic. And then for myself as an individual, sort of forming this third culture that's a blend of both. Well, I very much feel like communities such as El Paso and Juarez are almost like they're city forms of that. They're like third culture communities. They're not just the United States, they're not just Mexico. They're some of both, and there's something new that emerges. Something that has challenges, but also like immense beauty, and poses something beautiful and very valuable for the world to understand. And so that's part of what we really try to lean into through our work, is sort of providing opportunities for people to enter into that space that's not black and white. It's not either or. It's definitely a both and it can create a lot of confusion and internal confusion. And sorting through that can be challenging, but also I think super valuable in the end.
That's a lot of tension for folks to sit in those communities, and I think I really resonate with what you say about it. It's beautiful and it's challenging, and part of the work of mutual flourishing, of breaking down binaries, is moving away from this idea of us versus them to us together. And I think that these communities really show what that looks like. So often when we talk about border control or immigration, especially for folks who don't live in proximity to border communities, there is this real mentality of, well, you're one of us or you're one of them. And there are so many places and people, right, because migration is complicated, that exist in a liminal space where that's not a category they fall into. And I think that that's a really important tension for us to hold when we think about the impact of policies, right? You described the border fence, the impact on policies, on communities and on people who don't fit neatly into this category, and how they can invite us to think more expansively around what flourishing can look like. The other thing that comes up for me as you discuss this is that idea of proximity. I grew up in Vermont, about as far from the southern border as you can get. I haven't had the privilege of getting to come and experience the work in this community yet personally, but I think that part of proximity, being in community, experiencing the joy and the tensions, is a huge part of transformation. And I'd love to hear more about the work that Abara does on your listening trips. In part because part of your change theory that really resonates, I think, with how Telos sees our theory of change, is the idea of narrative change, personal change, and system change. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about the trips and the work that they do, inviting people into listening that leads to that kind of deeper transformation on those levels.
Yeah, I'd love to share more about that. I really, for myself, and each member of our team comes at it a little differently. For myself, of course, coming at it with my own story, of coming back and forth from the Middle East to the United States. Of course, mostly being in the Middle East, and then coming to the US and being really astounded by some of the perceptions of the Middle East from afar that were held so strongly. So I could come and let people know about my lived experience, but sometimes their strongly held beliefs and narratives were so tight, they held on to them so tight that they believed them more than someone who lived there telling them what something was actually like. So I've held that, I think, before I had words for it, sort of just like astounded by how a place, a nation, a people group, a religion can be framed from afar. Like when you don't have proximity, when you don't have relationship, when you don't have too much personal exposure, things can get framed very inaccurately, and they often are, especially if it's wanting to move a group towards a certain purpose. Um, and oftentimes, those narratives that we hold are reinforced at so many levels, right? Like it might be our history books might be highlighting a certain side of the history, and our faith leaders are even in the pulpit sort of withholding maybe that same strong narrative. Our politicians, our teachers around the family table. So all of these pieces are forming this narrative. But what's fascinating is oftentimes that narrative is not close or doesn't have that proximity to actual lived experience or like what it might truly be like. And so you can frame things in this binary, and you can also frame things often through fear. So when I landed at the border, not being from here, I've been here 20 years now. My wife is from El Paso. And I felt myself immediately feeling that same tension where I would see sort of posts, social media posts, or hear what some of my friends or family members were saying about the border. And it was so inaccurate. And of course, it's informed by these really strong narratives. And so I think from the beginning, just trying to like, from first moving here, think through how can we provide space for people enter into a journey to actually experience firsthand some of the realities and just hear and listen to the varied voices of the borderlands, and not necessarily trying to curate an exact result, but believing that when people actually can get in front of and meet other human beings in all of the diversity and the beauty, then there's a lot more potential for people to discern for themselves how to move forward. So when people arrive, and typically it's not too long of a time, oftentimes just 3 days, they might come with all sorts of feelings. A big feeling that often people come with is being nervous, and sometimes actually very afraid. Uh, but at minimum, usually nervous at least, because the narrative of sort of fear and sort of the rhetoric of invasion and danger has been so prominent for a while that it doesn't matter if someone is more liberal or conservative, most people arrive a little bit nervous. And what's really beautiful to watch that sort of fear fade away over a matter of hours or a day or two. And most people, when they leave, they've fallen in love with El Paso Juarez, and they verbally expressed that they arrived, having some element of fear. And actually, they were like, "I can't believe it. This is one of the most hospitable, kind, welcoming places I've ever been. I don't understand how I could have believed what I believed about the border." And I mean, even if you look at the data, El Paso is often in the top three safest large cities in the United States. That's not what gets highlighted most of the time. It's mostly like it's a war zone, right? So we literally have people ask us when they arrive, they're like, "So where is the war zone?" Or they're like, "I can see the invasion isn't here. So where is the invasion?" So I think that proximity comes at a lot of levels. One, of course, human being to human being. And then there's also this piece about sort of earthiness and physicality at the border. So part of why we're trying to redevelop this historic property that sits literally on the border fence is because of how compelling it is. When you're in the shadow of the border wall, something happens inside of you, especially when it's beautiful and there's music and there's beautiful food and dance and art, and so there's an emotional change. And we know, right, that like really that's what needs to happen. We need to be emotionally, we need to be in a place where we can actually think about things differently. So that usually comes before our actual thought processes will change. We have to have a different feeling. So if we encounter someone who's seeking asylum in a little church shelter, in a very simple community in Juarez, and all of a sudden have a deep care for this person and for their well-being, it informs the whole conversation. And when we stand in a place and are no longer afraid of that physical location, it has some change on us. And then we're open to it, can like really put us in a confused place because we're like, how could I have felt something so strongly a certain way? And now I'm feeling something inside that's so different than what I've felt or thought for so long. Um, and I'll say this, especially when we're thinking about sort of binaries and dualism. I think of the border and migration a lot more like a puzzle, maybe. Maybe it's got 10 pieces, maybe it's got 1,000 pieces, but we're constantly figuring, seeing and encountering different pieces of that puzzle and fitting in those pieces. It's not sort of one, like, oh, there's one truth over on this side and this other side is complete, you know, is completely false or evil, or that I need to flip around and think the other way. It's like, no, it's like, living here and in any community we live in, nobody wants to live in an insecure space. We care about safety. We don't want violence. So people in El Paso do think about that. And for someone to say that, oh, you don't care about that, like people are like, what do you mean? Like, I want to be able to walk on my streets and go to the park. And so, that is a piece of it. And also the humanity and the dignity of the human being who's arriving at the border is a piece. And also even the dignity and the humanity of a border patrol agent or other law enforcement agents. They're part of the community too. And there's a lot of layers there, no matter what people think about the policies or equal justice when it comes down to sort of being in front of another human being and looking for that mutual flourishing. It breaks down these walls and these binaries and makes people want to realize that things are a lot more complex, and then decide, given that these things are complex, how do I walk faithfully in that context?
Sammy, everything you just said to me so clearly highlights the value and the need to hold these perspectives in tension, not to decide which one is right, which one is wrong, right? This different form of zero sum binaries. And for us, holding perspectives in tension recognizes that truth that engaging the views and experiences of others, even or especially when they don't reconcile with our own, is what unlocks our collective ability to better identify causes of and solutions to violence, to conflict. And it also makes me think, right? You named that a lot of folks come in with a sense of unease or potential discomfort. I think so often we seek to be comfortable, and leaning into that discomfort, right? That kind of messy space is where the deeper transformation is possible, where we step beyond our comfort zones. And when we talk about listening, one of the quotations we often bring in is from Paul Tillich, and it's that love's first act is to listen. I think this is such a huge part of it, right? All of us probably come in with particular political perspectives or ideas about systems change that might need to happen, but stepping into that space of deep listening, being willing to hear someone else's story, leaning into the complexity, is what lets us see the world the way it is before we can transform it. And in light of all of that, I'm wondering if you would be willing to share a story that really illustrates how this narrative change enables personal transformation, but then also led to people being able to change how they show up in the world, right? How they might work for systems change, or how they take what they've learned and heard and gone back to their communities and advocated or engaged differently.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of examples and varied examples of beautiful sort of journeys that we get to witness, or we get to bear witness to maybe a short little piece of it while someone's here, and then find out more later as we get feedback either directly or indirectly and see some of what's happened. Of course, we love to stay in tight connection, but that's not always the case of what happens. I'll share one story, and this was, I think, there was a number of leaders that were visiting who were advocates at the state level in their various states, representing 10 or 15, probably like 15 states, I think, on family values. So very much like trying to advocate for strong family values at the state level with their lawmakers. Some of them had been in political offices before, or at least in like the offices of their state legislators, or were advisors. Um, I really wasn't sure how it would go, but there was definitely, like, there was a lot of interest from the community. And the time ended, and we had, as normal, quite a few people that just interpersonally came up and expressed deep gratitude. But I think one thing I heard back indirectly from the organizer of that trip was somebody who had given him this feedback a couple weeks later. He said, from the policy level that I was working in, it was an absolute no-brainer to be sort of speaking in negative terms about immigration and the border, because it's like one of the quickest way to get votes and to get money. So like from a strategic sense, it made a whole lot of sense. And it's like, and now, like, having come and visited the border and visited in a shelter and witnessed some of the complexity and of what's happening, it's like I'm never going to be able to do that again. Never going to be able to paint the border and migration in sort of this, in a singularly negative light, in order to produce votes and money. So like that's sort of an example at a sort of systems level. I think much more so we see at a very human interpersonal level, people decide to break outside of some of their, like you mentioned, comfort, just sort of just the comfort. We'll hear sort of stories in coming back to us about, hey, I often might sit quietly, whether it's at the gas station or at an appointment, and I see someone who's covered, like a Muslim woman who's covered, and I don't know what to say or if I should say anything, and so I just stay quiet. But like I'm able to like push through and just start asking questions and strike up a friendship, and it was obviously it was welcomed that I had reached out. So just like at a really small level, sort of breaking through those boundaries of discomfort. And I found in my own life that that's something that, I mean, it's a muscle that gets strengthened, but there's always, entering into a new situation, a level of discomfort. And so being able to like actually recognize that and still push through it. And when something is new and something is different, and I might be nervous and I might be feeling like I don't want to be stupid and say something wrong, but like, okay, I'll do the best as I can, but I'll like try to push through that discomfort to actually get to some sort of conversation and maybe even relationship. So that's like at a very micro level, right? Like a personal change. We also love it if groups or organizations or churches really feel drawn to try to think about what they can be doing about root causes. And some of those might be in countries that are experiencing displacement, where people feel like they're having to flee from, or it might be in related to root causes of US policies or other types of policies that might be lending to migration or forced migration. And so it's really beautiful when we hear back. I loved it. We heard back from a church leader who had visited, and we often sort of suggest, hey, there's ways to get involved. Maybe it's in Guatemala or in Colombia or Honduras or Syria, even wherever it is, right around the world. Maybe find if you're with a church and a denomination, it's a very natural way to find a partner, like a church that's doing amazing work on the ground in their community, to try to love their community and stabilize the community. And then also you could support the work that's happening on the border, a lot of which is churches as well that are responding. And then what can you be doing in your own backyard, which might be the most important thing, like across the street in Kansas City. And so when we hear back from like this one church I have in mind, they were doing exactly that. They're like, we've decided we're strengthening this partnership in Guatemala. We want to bring groups regularly to the border to understand better, so more of our congregation and our community understands. And now we've really strengthened the partnerships in our own community, and they started bringing some of those local partnerships in their community to better understand the context. And sort of, we love that, trying to connect the dots between root causes to migrant pathways to what's happening at the border, and then maybe people landing in people's backyards. So those are beautiful, I think, examples of sort of some of the changes that happen. And oftentimes it's not that people were disinterested before and now they're interested. There's usually some level of interest, but just not knowing how to move forward. So I think of another young lady who was a young mom, and this season in her life was mostly at home. and thinking like, I don't know what on earth I can do from North Carolina in my community from home. She's like, well, I'll do what I can do. I'm going to just host a dinner conversation and invite anybody who will come listen. And she invited 10 or 15 people. They came, they were so taken by what she said. She kept sending text updates, and within like at least less than 6 months, she had probably been in front of 300 people that she had shared, and from that got to invited to speak at a citywide gathering. And it just has led to all sorts of different pieces in her life. And it was just her taking one little step, saying, I'm going to take the little seed of what I have and what I've learned and what I know, and share it with my community. Um, and it's not always going to go big, but it doesn't matter if it's 2 people, if it's 10 people, it's something.
Yeah, I love that idea. I'll do what I can do where I have access and agency, and recognizing that immigration is not just an issue, right? That's in one particular part of the US. All of our communities, no matter where we are, right? We have immigrant communities, we have immigrants who are our friends and neighbors, our family. And I think understanding the ways that we need to think about this in terms of, bigger US systems, bigger global systems, but also there's an invitation to respond in a deeply local way. It doesn't matter if you don't feel like that small action is going to do something against the bigger systems change that needed. Like you just shared, Sami, right? Those small actions matter. Using your agency to speak in your community, to invite other people into the complexity is a huge part of how we can be a part of working for, right, mutual flourishing, or a healthier way of engaging these deeply complex issues. I also want to pick up on that bigger context and some of what you mentioned around curiosity around stories that are happening not in the US but are tied to immigration. One of the things we talk about at Telos sometimes is it depends on where you start the story, right? Are we asking questions about what came first or earlier, or are we starting a story at a certain point? Does the question of migration start when people arrive at our border? Does it start when they leave their home country? Or does it start 30 years ago when the US contributed to destabilizing political actions? Immigration is not my area of expertise, but one of the things that I understand the framework as including is these ideas of push and pull factors of migration. Sometimes pull factors are what people come seeking in the US, right? Wonderful things we have here that people might want to be a part of. But there are also push factors that contribute to why people have to leave their home communities, their home countries, sometimes places they deeply love and would like to stay in, but for a variety of reasons can't always. And I want to bring this piece in if you're willing, because I think this gets to the idea of US implication as well. And I think implication is an important piece because where we're implicated, we also have opportunity. And I think sometimes people don't want to engage some of these topics because it feels like, well, that's stepping into someone else's territory, or, this doesn't have anything to do with me. I think understanding US implication, right, our contribution to some of these push factors is a helpful conviction of why we also need to be engaged when it comes to peacemaking or transforming realities today. So all of that is a very long lead up to asking you if you could share a little bit more about some of those push factors in some of the countries that contribute to people needing to come to the US or needing to leave their homelands, that are deeply tied to US implication and needing to dismantle some of those inequities.
Yeah, great question. It's usually one of our initial presentations is on, we've changed the title over the years depending on what's happening globally, but it's usually like global migration, for instance, and Latin American realities. Yeah, but the whole point is trying to think about what are the realities on the ground leading to people to change, whether it's push or pull. And it's so complex and there's so many layered reasons that I think it prevents some people from even entering into it, because you're like, well, what am I supposed to do with all of this information? And of course, it's tied regionally or even to a certain country or even like to subspaces within a country and can change a little bit. But by and large, what we're seeing right now in Venezuela is different than a lot of spaces in the world where people are fleeing from or leaving or feeling forced to leave. And it's really, I mean, it's tied to political and economic policies, and of course, exacerbated by US sanctions and disagreements about government style, as well as, like, of course, internal corruption and the economic instability and inflation, and all of these issues that have led to really the majority of the country not knowing where their next meal is going to come from. And then in that vacuum, you do have gangs, and you do have sort of violent activity, but that wasn't where it started. And 1 out of every 4 people in Venezuela has left in the last number of years. Now, the vast majority of those are in Latin America still. And one of the things that we highlight is that this is a global story. The story of migration is a global story, and the US is not the center of this story. It's hard to think about that when we're seeing the media every day that's only talking about what's happening in the US. But if you look at the number of the world's displaced, and for instance, let's say the US population, US is roughly 4.5% of the world's population. But even with the highest numbers we've known arriving at our border and entering otherwise, we still only have maybe 2% of the world's displaced that we're dealing with. So 4% of the world's population, you would think, okay, if we were just going to do our fair share, maybe we would be dealing with 4% of the world's displaced. Well, we're only dealing with 2%, and that's taking all the numbers as a whole that reach the border, not including those that are turned away. When we think about those that are actually given access to pursuing something in the US, it's even less. This is a huge issue globally. The US isn't the center of it. It doesn't mean we don't have challenges. For sure, there's challenges at the border, and we're trying to figure a lot of things out. And then when we think about why is everyone leaving, like to your question, we have 2 years ago, the presentation was completely different than what it is today because of the realities of countries. But let's say, like, to your question about like Guatemala, for instance, there was many Guatemalans and Hondurans, El Salvadorians that were arriving 3, 4, 6 years ago. If we think about Guatemala, the U.S. intervened in Guatemala during the Cold War to support and arm a coup that displaced the popularly elected socialist president. Within a few years, Guatemala descended into civil war, which isn't surprising since the person in charge was not who the people wanted in charge, but it was who the US wanted in charge. And that civil war lasted 36 years. It just ended in the 90s. And so Guatemala is trying to pull out of this and then find themselves in the middle of sort of drug trade coming through there, but then taking advantage of those travel routes as well, because they realized, oh, the travel routes are the similar routes as what human beings are taking, and sort of some of the gangs were consolidating those routes. But then the drug consumption is in the US. So even like the product, like the market for these drugs is predominantly in the US. So we think about that as a root cause too. There's a gentleman locally here who's been involved with hospitality for the most vulnerable migrants on the borderlands for 45 years. And I've heard him many times say, as long as we continue to consume illegal drugs to the extent that we do in the United States, then we have a moral obligation to take every single person that comes to us from the South, because he sees it correlated so tightly. The money that we're paying from the US for illicit drugs is going in the hands of the destabilizing forces in these countries that are sort of creating violence and chaos in those countries. Our domestic policies also impact, for instance, when we have ICE raids and deportations. In the US, we might think about it as this singular story. This one person was deported who was not here with legal status. But let's say that's someone from Honduras, where one of the highest sources of income is actually money being sent back from people working in the US to family members in Honduras. If that income is no longer being able to send back, all of a sudden the family in Honduras might not have the economic stability to feel like they could keep staying, and maybe someone else would come north. So it's complicated, and there's multiple layers, but there's quite a few layers, I think, where the US is implicated. And like you said, that gives a lot of opportunity for us in the US. But first of all, we need to know the ways in which we've been implicated, or continue to be. And so being able to at least, briefly highlight those, it opens up the opportunities to investigate those a little more thoroughly.
Yeah, I think that curiosity around what are those threads, what are those pieces that we don't know, right? It's not just listening to understand individual perspectives, but listening to understand and holding in tension all of the factors that push and pull human migration. And I think what you said, Sammy, that I'll chew on for a while, right, is the the fact that this feels like it's a US centric issue, but global migration, right, is a bigger system and flow of people that we are one small part of. And I think for me, part of this points back to mutual flourishing then, and this question of who is my neighbor. Mutual flourishing is rooted in the belief that what I want for myself, I also want for my neighbor, and that, no one can really flourish until everyone is flourishing, which might feel naive and idealistic. No one has ever accused me of being overly realistic on the idealism realism spectrum, but I think is an important lens into looking at this with an orientation towards healing, repair, justice, right? These are big issues that aren't going to go away overnight. But I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to speak into around what an alternative vision for collective flourishing or liberation for all could look like coming out of your work in the borderlands communities. What are the unique insights that this area provides towards what collective flourishing can look like beyond our imagination of what it looks like right now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we're thinking about all the time, really. And I think, sometimes the easiest way to look at that, and really the one that we have the most control over, of course, is the hyper local. And what can I be doing with my direct sphere of influence, with those who I come in contact with? And then, of course, also trying to examine it at a broader regional level or systems level, which really systems are just, how do these decisions impact a community as opposed to an individual? I think we can make it more complicated than that, but really it's sort of like what are the structures that are put in place for communities? And so how can we seek mutual flourishing in that regard? You were calling this space that we're redeveloping Abara House, a Borderland Center for Beloved Community. Abara is a Semitic word. It's similar in Arabic and Hebrew, and it means a river ford or a river crossing. And so Abara House is sort of house of the crossing, and it's sitting on this ancient river crossing of the Rio Grande that was used for hundreds of years. So when we're thinking about context and root causes, we're thinking both current day or last 50 years, like globally, but then we're also thinking very deeply in this one place what has happened over the last 500 years. And it gives us an amazing perspective, I think, on thinking about mutual flourishing, partially because there's so many layers where one community was not seeking mutual flourishing in the exact spot where we were or where we are. And so, because it was this natural river crossing, every successive empire and group that was in control used it. So that's why you had all these people coming through this one space, because it was so strategic. So indigenous communities were crossing. When the Spanish arrived, that is literally the location they chose to cross into what's now the United States. So it's these original settler colonial footsteps into what's now the US. When the Spanish arrived, the Juan de Oñate was so brutal in this community that he was actually banished by the King of Spain back to Spain because of his brutality. We end up sometimes in fights locally here, like, did he cut the foot off of every remaining member of this tribe, or was it the toes or the fingers? I think the broader issue is, we know it was bad enough that it violated the colonial handbook. So that initial arrival of Europeans here was not seeking mutual flourishing, right? It's one community over another. And the stories, of course, of history is mostly that, right? Like, we take control and we keep it to preserve safety for our people versus other people, whoever's defined in and out. And I think what's so unique in this setting here is that then there was 200 years of Spanish history, then Mexican independence, then this Anglo westward expansion with the US under Manifest Destiny, Sea to Shining Sea. And at that point, this land became part of the United States. The man who then built a house that then became a restaurant that now we're redeveloping into the hub of our center, he built that in the early 1850s. It was the earliest built structure in our area on the US side of the river. This was a decade or so before the Civil War. He brought with him African American slaves and then migrant labor across this newly established border from Mexico. So laborers from Mexico and African-American slaves were running the mill that ground out flour to distribute to this community. And it was known as a place of hospitality for many, but of course that there was plenty that it wasn't hospitable for. And so you have these different versions of history about, who was welcomed and who wasn't. When the Civil War ended, the U.S. really sort of went full steam ahead on the sort of building out the railway tracks heading west to settle the West. And the railway connecting sort of Florida to California comes right through the edge of our property because it's this pass through the mountains as well as a pass across the river. That railway track was built with migrant Chinese labor. So there was 300 Chinese laborers who settled in El Paso in 1881, built the railway tracks, and then the U.S. enforced its first major immigration act the very next year in 1882 that was known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. So just on our property, you can see sort of like, okay, we welcome the labor. Thank you for building the railway. And now you're no longer welcome. So again, that's probably not, like, to me, that doesn't come across as seeking mutual flourishing. It's sort of like seeking my own flourishing at the end with a whole lot of other people contributing to it. And then if it's convenient to have someone contribute to it, that's good. But then it's sort of like pushed back afterwards. And so, that's been the story in this area. And then later on, in the early 1900s, many communities were excluded from coming to the US. The Jewish community, by and large, could not enter the US legally. Many communities from the Middle East couldn't. So you have those stories and relevant to El Paso, you have Jewish communities that couldn't come straight to the US. So they went to Mexico and snuck across the border and landed in El Paso and have settled here. You also had Christian, Syrian, and Lebanese communities that the Ottoman Empire had crumbled. There was a lot of uncertainty and nervousness with some of the Christian communities, the Antiochian Orthodox communities in Syria. They came to Mexico and snuck across the border and have settled here. And then the versions of like what happened historically sort of change over time, and you may or may not actually be welcoming to the next wave that comes. So when you ask the question, like, what do we see as mutual flourishing? It's almost like we can point back in history to so many layers of where we didn't seek mutual flourishing. And so really it's almost like in the shadow of this division of the border fence at a site where so many people crossed and sought safety going one way or the other over centuries. What does it mean to seek mutual flourishing? What does it look like to have beloved community? What does understanding, like opening up the space for the stories of these communities to be heard? And we feel like this is, as you were saying, I don't know if we probably say it exactly the same way, but I believe probably the impetus is the same, is we have to start with stories having a space for stories to be told, and be told truthfully and in all of its pain, and space for a community to put forward its pain and the suffering that has been caused. Because as long as one community is denying that pain has existed, then I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to move forward towards mutual flourishing. We have to start seeing clearly what has been done, even what has been done by our own communities or in the name of our own communities. And then hopefully being heartbroken and sitting in this lament, not knowing what on earth to do, because maybe feeling like this is terrible. And this wasn't me. It wasn't even some direct ancestor, right? So you also were confused because you're like, well, what do I do about it? It wasn't me. But I benefit from some of those decisions that were made. So, sitting in lament, I think, and in the unknown and in the darkness for a while is actually is what a lot of faith communities, including the Christian faith community, through time has really advocated for. And then I think in mutuality, as we're holding hands with our brothers and sisters, sitting in this pain and the suffering, then it's like, only then almost can we like start imagining steps forward. I don't have the answer for exactly what, even in this community, what mutual flourishing looks like, but I know it has to, I feel, I mean, at the depth of my soul, like it has to start with these stories, like having space to be told in their fullness, And it's not all dark. Some of it's so beautiful too. And that's part of the tension, is like the pain and the beauty that coexist. And so I think only then can we take the steps forward that would allow us to understand what equal justice looks like, what peace looks like what true peace looks like, what healing looks like, or healing ethnic wounds. What does that look like? And before any of those, or I mean, all of those things need to take place before we think about like what does reconciliation look like, or like a real transformation towards mutual flourishing. But those are all very solid pieces for us. So we say we envision a global beloved community flourishing through justice, peace, healing, and transformation. And a lot of those words are used globally in many settings, including in the Holy Land, as Muslims and Christians and Jews, Israelis, Palestinians working together in some of the hardest of times, still believing in these amazing, beautiful tenets that we have to believe that that's how we move forward. You know, whether like me as people of faith, maybe that's what's driving people, or something else. But I think we see those threads through history and over so many places about like what it means to move towards that I think there's so much connection between all of us to agree that that's how we can move forward.
Hmm. That's really powerful, Sami. It makes me think too. My colleague David Kataba offers us the framework that to become a people of hope, we need three things: lament, imagination, and action. And I think that came up for me really strongly in everything you just named. Part of it is lamenting the immense violence, the historic divides, the us versus them mentalities, the long, long history of conquest and division and real pain that has been acted against so many different communities and histories. And I think what you named, right, the heartbreak as you start to listen to these different stories and hold these perspectives in tension is so real and it's painful and uncomfortable, but also why we need communities that help us see that joy, right? That hold that tension of there's a history of pain, but there's also a history of resilience and music across the border fence and all of these other things that also provide the imagination, then, right, the prophetic imagination of what that world can look like, and sitting in that tension itself, right? Lamenting the reality today, lamenting the violence of the past and present, but also envisioning what the future can look like. That is what lets us act in ways that interrupt that violence, that build towards the beloved community, that invite us to own our agency and respond to the implication of not being part of the problem, but being part of the communities working for peaceful, justice-oriented solutions and different ways of engaging. So I'm so grateful for everything you shared with us, all of the different pieces you've teased out. It's left me with more questions and follow-up narratives to seek out than answers. And I hope that everyone who's heard this goes and learns from Abara directly, whether it's through a border encounter or through some of your online resources. But I wonder, Sami, if you can leave us with a call to action. In response to this conversation today, in response to everything you've shared, what would you like people to do, right? Because just learning isn't always enough. We have to take what we learn, let it convict us, let it transform us, and then go out and do something with it, even if it's, diving deeper into some of the stories. So what's the call to action you'd like to leave us with today?
I would say the most fundamental call to action would be, if you find yourself in the center, in sort of majority culture US, if you're listening from the US, or if you find yourself in the majority culture wherever you are, I would say go to the edge, go to the margins, go to minority groups, go to a community that where the systems aren't designed for them. Because if you go and you listen to stories and then keep an open, maybe there's a lot of sort of pushback that you have internally, go back and listen again, listen to someone else. If you start hearing these sort of patterns emerging of what people are saying, I think we need to take those really, really seriously. Don't push them aside because they seem inconvenient or don't fit in with your worldview or our worldview. And I'm saying this, I say this just as much to myself always as anyone else, but be curious enough and humble enough to go forward and seek out even more, because I think that's where we're really going to find some truths that we weren't really aware of, and can really help us, hopefully through proximity, through relationship, see things in a different way, and then action's going to emerge out of that. So I would say that the action that I would encourage is just push to the edge and remain open and remain open and remain open through the discomfort, because you might be very surprised at what's found, and that could go in any direction. Maybe it means well, I don't know what it means in your context, but it could mean all sorts of things. I know for me sometimes the communities that it's pushed me towards listening to are ones that I'm like least most likely not wanting to listen to, right? And then that ends up being more transformational for me.
Thanks, Sami, for that call to action. It's a super important reminder and is reconvicting, I hope, for everyone who's listening to this, who holds these values and continually needs to be invited into proximity, into challenging ourselves to push ourselves even further. So thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and the work you're doing on the ground. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.